Good afternoon, good morning to folks dialing in from Europe. Welcome to this webinar, which is entitled CCUS, an Imperative for Asia, hosted by the British Chamber of Commerce here in Singapore. My name is Ben Arnott, and I run the Energy Finance and Advisory business for Societe Generale here in Southeast Asia. I'm also part of the Energy. In my spare time, I'm involved with the British Chamber of Commerce, and I take part in the Energy and Utilities Business Group. We work hard to bring topical events and discussions to the business community in Singapore and wider to the ASEAN region, hosting events like this. And in better times, we also host in-person events as well. So be good to see you all in person at some time in the future. We certainly try and get on the front foot each year, trying to set a cutting-edge agenda in the energy and utilities space. And this discussion on CCUS is absolutely part of that drive. We see our efforts as especially important this year because the UN climate talks, COP26, are being hosted in Glasgow in November 2021. Specifically, the British Chamber of Commerce has a Road to Net Zero theme. It's a wide-ranging initiative focusing on business response and opportunities, with the overall aim to align stakeholders to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Do take a look at the microsite, which can be found via the main BritCham page. Now, onto the topic in hand, carbon capture, utilization and storage. If you've read anything about the sector in the last 12 to 18 months, you'll be aware of the absolute imperative to develop this industry in order to achieve the environmental targets we set ourselves. It's not enough to develop more wind and solar power or to mobilize a massive electric vehicle fleet. We need to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And in fact, if we achieve that, it'll give us incredible optionality. In some ways, this is the ideal topic for the British Chamber of Commerce. There's some fantastic developments to showcase from the UK on the policy side, on the project development side, on the financing side. But no one country can act in isolation on something as large as climate change. There's also lessons to be learned from other parts of the world, whether that be US, Canada, Norway, Australia, or China. And we'll refer to some of these during our discussion. So let me briefly set the scene for you. I'm going to move through these slides quickly because I want to introduce our panelists as soon as possible. Thank you. Okay, scale of the issue. 55 gigatons CO2 equivalent emitted by our industrial and social activities during 2018. And much of it's from hard to decarbonise sectors, baseload power, industrial processes like cement and steel manufacture, and transport. So that's the scale of the issue. So next slide, please. And it's a global problem. Developed economies, the large developing economies of the world, the large population centres, all emitting greenhouse gases and contributing to this issue. Next slide, please. In truth, the current stock of CCUS and pure CCS facilities don't scratch the surface in terms of sequestering or dealing with CO2 emissions currently. There are 21 fully operational projects globally with a combined capture capacity of just 0.04 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. That's less than 0.1% of total CO2 emissions. So a long way to go. Next slide, please. Clearly, action's required. And the good news is that a number of countries have made major new project announcements, policy announcements on grants in the last 12 to 24 months. The scale of the challenge is huge in terms of investment required. We're talking tens, hundreds of billions of dollars required to develop CCS and CCUS by 2030. But it's also, therefore it's also a huge financing challenge as well. Next slide, please. In terms of projects operational or under construction, the Southeast Asia region, the ASEAN region is lagging somewhat. There's activity fairly nearby in the Middle East, in China, in Australia, but whilst it's part of the problem, Southeast Asia is not currently part of the solution. Next slide, please. But it's not true to say this region is unable to implement the kinds of solutions we're seeing in other parts of the world. We have established gas networks, industrial clusters, numerous depleted oil and gas reservoirs, and a very interesting discussion we had just before we started here today on the potential for use of saline reservoirs to store CO2, use of potential reservoirs that have not been charged by oil and gas just through luck or design. So, you know, the ability to store CO2 is certainly here in this region. Next slide, please. The incentives for CCS, CCUS. How do you make a business out of capturing what is often a waste product, transporting it and burying it? It's a central question to this debate, and governments around the world have introduced various responses. The 45Q tax incentive in the US, a carbon tax in a number of locations, including here in Singapore and in Norway, and emissions trading schemes in the EU, and most recently announced in China. I should also mention the significant grants that are on offer by the UK. I think £1 billion, the EU, and we're starting to see that also in the Asia region, with Singapore announcing research grants as well in the recent weeks. Next slide, please. Cost of carbon. We could have had a webinar just on this topic, but suffice to say, CO2 has a value in some circumstances where it's used, where it's utilized. And this slide shows those kind of value points for various industries. But there's also a cost. The externalities of emitting CO2 into the atmosphere clearly have an environmental cost and a social cost. And the level of where that cost lies is probably the big question of our time. I'm pleased to say we have 4 esteemed panelists to give you a flavor of their experience in this sector. First is a colleague of mine, Alan Baker. He's our global head of Power and Advisory and Project Finance for Societe Generale. He's based in London. He's worked for Societe Generale for 12 years, and he's been involved in the power sector for more than 30 years, initially as an engineer and then in finance. In recent years, he's been instrumental in bringing the financing perspective to the policy debate around CCS, and he's advised several of the world's largest CCS projects. He was a member of the UK's government's original CCS Development Forum and is now a member of the current CCUS Council, as well as contributing to the UK Cost Challenge Task Force. He's currently acting as financial advisor for the Net Zero Teesside project in the UK, and he's previously acted as financial advisor for the White Rose CCS project in the UK also. Also the Teesside Industrial CCS project in the UK, the Abu Dhabi CCS project, and the Parafuel CCS project in the Don Valley. Our second panelist today is Dr. Nick Cooper. He's Chief Executive of Storega Geotechnologies. He became the Chief CEO in 2019. His career has been in the international upstream sector and also previously in corporate finance. His face may be familiar to a number of you in Asia. As prior to Storega, Nick was Chief Executive Officer of Ophir Energy and also CFO of Salamander Energy PLC, both Asia-focused E&P companies here. He began his career as a geophysicist with BG and Amoco before joining Booz Allen and Hamilton. And prior to that, he was in the oil and gas team at Goldman Sachs. Our third panelist today is Alex Tate. He's a chartered chemical engineer with a breadth of experience across the oil and gas industry, most recently broadening into carbon capture and storage. Starting in BP's engineering function, he then moved to work offshore in the North Sea as a production engineer before transitioning to a commissioning and startup role on the Shah Deniz project in Azerbaijan. He's very much still a BP employee. I should have mentioned that. In early 2019, he moved into a project management role on the Net Zero Teesside project. Welcome, Alex. Last but not least, Jim Mao Zhu is an energy specialist in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department of the Asian Development Bank. He's more than 15 years experience in the energy field. He's responsible for CCUS and low carbon energy related work in the department, administering technical assistance across the region. His experience and expertise includes energy and environmental technologies, policies, and programs. I hope you're interested in what they have to say questions, please use the chat function on your screen. But to start off, I'm going to ask them each of them in turn. Why is CCS so important to you? And why do you think it should be important for everyone on the call? Let me turn to Alan first.
Okay, for me, I think CCS is important, not least because I spent around 15 years trying to actually finance a CCS project without success. But I think we're now at the stage where there's a wide recognition that CCS is required for decarbonisation, particularly to meet net zero targets. So I see carbon capture and storage as one of the mainstays of our sort of green financing initiative. It plays as well into the hydrogen sector, another key decarbonisation vector. So I think it's one of those areas which is now hopefully moving into the mainstream and is a business opportunity, but also good in terms of trying to meet climate goals and decarbonising the industry.
Thank you, Alan. Nick, let me turn to you now. Let me ask you the same question. Why is CCS so important to you and Storegga?
Hi, Ben, and hello to everybody on the call. I think Alan took most of the words out of my mouth, so what can I add to that? Well, I think, as Alan said, CCS has gone in the last couple of years from being perhaps on the margins of the debate to being seen as a very central tool to achieving net zero now. And the earlier false starts in various parts of the world and the under build out or the slow rollout of this technology is looking to be a thing of the past. It also enables a chain of carbon reduction removal activities, which I guess we'll touch on today. And without the storage, most of those are completely pointless. So it's crucial, and not least for me because I've got 3 teenage daughters that won't let me forget the climate issue, even if I had wanted to.
Thank you, Nick. I'll turn to Alex next. He's a very passionate advocate of CCS, CCUS. Alex, why is it so important to you, and why do you think it should be important for everybody on this call?
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, absolutely. I do passionately care about CCS. I've been involved in writing about it even since my dissertation. So I think one key fundamental point I would get across is that there is no silver bullet to climate change. There's no one solution which solves the enormous problem there is. And I think why is CCS so important to me and why should it be so important to everyone is fundamentally because so many of the technologies we need depend on CCS to work, as Nick sort of alluded to then. Being able to capture and store CO2 enables us to kind of really initiate this energy revolution that we really, really desperately need to continue providing heat, light, mobility, power to the world and reducing the carbon footprint. So as I'm sure we'll talk about a lot more in the next hour and a half or so, CCS is really the bedrock which all of that can build upon.
Thank you, Alex. Jinmao, let me turn to you finally and ask you the same question, perhaps with an Asian hat on. Why is it so important to you personally, and why is it so important to everybody?
Okay, thank you, Ben. In one sentence, I think CCS is indispensable to achieving for CO2 emission reduction rapidly and meeting climate mitigation and carbon neutrality in Asia and the Pacific. For Asia, a large-scale CCS demonstration project is imperative for this region.
Thank you, Jim. That's great. Okay, I'm going to ask the panelists. We've got a couple of presentations for you, and Nick's going to start with an introduction of his company and his work in CCS.
Thanks, Ben. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Storegga is a relatively new company, as mentioned before. It is an independent company, private company, focused solely on low carbon activities and the infrastructure build out required for carbon reduction and removal. Next slide, please. So to set the scene, you can see on the left-hand side an EU map as produced by the EU, showing the countries which have the best storage potential as currently understood for Europe, and they are highlighted in red. They are surrounding the North Sea and the sedimentary sequences in the North Sea. And the storage numbers do move around a little bit, but most people would hold that for the total storage capacity for CO2 in Europe, as currently understood, approximately 50%, 50, sits in Norwegian offshore waters, approximately 45% in UK offshore waters, and the remaining 5% is along the North European coast. What that means, therefore, is a couple of key takeaways. Firstly, is that most of Europe does not have currently recognized storage capacity, and what it has is quite limited. So therefore, to facilitate the hydrogen economy and the various carbon reduction and removal plans of the EU, a lot of volumes will inevitably be moving northwards to Norwegian and UK projects. So that sets up a series of value chains and cross-border interactions. Also, the obvious point is that the storage in Europe, as currently understood, is mostly offshore, as indeed it would be in Asia. This is a contrast to the majority of the currently operating CCS projects that Ben was talking about before, which have been traditionally mostly in North America, where generally the emissions are stored beneath your feet, onshore. So at the point, so you're storing the CO2 at the point of emission or very close to the point of emission. That template is not necessarily going to be that useful elsewhere in the world. The European template, or this template of needing to move CO2 across borders and to collect CO2 from aggregated emissions points and physically transport it to storage locations, is a template that I think most observers are recognizing is going to be needed for other areas, including, for example, Asia Pacific. And so whilst the models in Norway and the UK are by no means fully complete, and I'm sure Alex would agree, we're going through a learning process with the UK government at the moment, which we'll talk about. The template that's emerging from Norway and the UK is one that can be used to and adapted to other areas, and will avoid probably a decade's worth of learning if people choose to go that route. On the right-hand side, you can see the main emissions clusters in the UK centered around the main industrial areas. And these are emissions from power and industry rather than the other sectors that Ben talked about before. The UK government has chosen to pair up the emission centres. So for example, Teesside, where Alex is working, Grangemouth and the Acorn Project, where I'm working up in Scotland, and pair up the emissions clusters with offshore storage locations to create viable projects. And it's this pairing that establishes the value chains. Next slide, please. So this is a very simplistic representation of how it all fits together, at least from our perspective. And this is pretty generic, I think, and hopefully is a template that most people could recognize and use elsewhere. At the bottom of this funnel is the permanent geological storage of CO2. Without this, pretty much everything on that diagram does not exist. As Alex said, without CCS, a lot of the activities for net zero cannot take place. You then have a midstream component, if you like, of moving the CO2 from the points of emission to the points of storage, and that's either by pipe or ship. And in some larger countries, it will also be by rail car and road over time, but the majority of volumes will be moved by pipe and ship. You then need to turn to the areas where the CO2 is actually collected. And I think it's good to divide these between emissions reduction technologies, so abatement for existing power and industrial plants, for example, allowing us to continue to use our industrial processes, but in a lower carbon way. And then also the technologies for CO2 removal. So these are pure carbon negative activities, and they're quite profound. We'll turn to those in a second. If we look at the four main areas, and it does fall into four buckets, I think, there's the industrial and power CO2 capture, which is the majority of the focus, certainly in the UK. And that is capturing CO2 from the emissions gas from chimneys, typically at 5 to 25% unit composition. And in a European context, the cheapest that can be done is probably 30 euros a ton of CO2, and the price will increase depending on your amount of CO2 per unit volume and the other impurities in the exhaust gases. You then have a second bucket of blue hydrogen. Now, blue hydrogen is relatively easy to manufacture. It's been made in refinery processes for decades. However, for net zero, it's a rather pointless exercise unless you have a storage for CO2, because to create blue hydrogen from natural gas, you create hydrogen, you create CO2. You need a store of CO2, but if you have a store of CO2, this gives you access to large volumes of hydrogen relatively quickly if you can build markets for them. And so typically you're seeing blue hydrogen projects piggyback on storage, CCS storage projects. So two areas of emissions reduction. Then on the removal side, you've got BECCS, which is effectively, you know, the bioenergy power generation going straight into CCS. And then you have direct air capture. Now, direct air capture is one of the sort of emerging technological solutions for carbon negative. It's currently quite expensive, and one of the earlier slides that Ben showed, you know, the cheapest people expect to be able to get it down to is probably around $100 a ton, because you're capturing CO2 from the atmosphere on a parts per million basis, so it's 0.04%, as opposed to the 5 to 25% unit volume that you would see for industrial and power. So you need to process a lot more air to get a ton of CO2. However, it is profoundly interesting, because if you scale it enough, if you think about it, that not only helps with the forward net zero targets, it can undo some prior emissions damage. So direct air capture and BECCS are getting quite a lot of attention as carbon negative technologies. They both need somewhere to store your CO2. So that is if you like, a simplistic diagram. Others will show it slightly differently, but that hopefully shows how all this fits together. Next slide, please. Just briefly, so the Acorn project is one of the 4 UK projects. They are all excellent projects. They all should go ahead, and will need more. As Ben said earlier, we're only storing 40 million tonnes a year globally of CO2 at the moment. We need to be doing over 5.5 gigatons a year. And there's 21 operational projects. The IEA is forecasting we need over 2,000 operational projects. So there's at least 100 times increase needed in the number of projects and storage from where we are now for this to be the contributor to net zero that we need it to be. Acorn is but one example of that. Acorn pivots around a gas terminal called St Fergus on the northeast coast of Scotland, as you can see on this map. It currently imports about a third of the UK's gas through a series of pipelines. Several of those are now redundant and would be decommissioned, but they have been held for CCS. And the idea is to collect CO2 at St Fergus and then send it offshore using these old repurposed gas and condensate pipelines and permanently store it in a series of licenses offshore. The CO2 will come from up a pipe from the main industrial cluster in the industrial belt of Scotland near Glasgow and Edinburgh, around Grangemouth. It will also come in by ship from around the UK and, as we mentioned before, most likely from Northern Europe because of the storage needs there. We will also be siting direct air capture close to this area. So Acorn is quite an interesting example of that template in that it has pretty much all of the elements of the funnel I just showed you. Next slide, please. This simply shows Acorn and how it interacts with blue hydrogen, which we'll be manufacturing also at this location. So as I've said before, the UK's gas is coming in, and that's denoted by the pink arrow from offshore UK and Norway, about a third of our gas. A blue hydrogen plant will be sited at St Fergus. That will crack the gas into pure hydrogen and CO2. The CO2 will be stored back into Acorn, where we have no real capacity constraints. Acorn and its pipelines are close to almost 20% of Europe's total storage capacity. So whilst all of these projects have bottlenecks, storage is not a bottleneck for Acorn or really the other UK projects. There's plenty of storage capacity out there. And then the blue hydrogen will be used locally for mobility so bus fleets and the like, and also plans for hydrogen cities in Aberdeen and elsewhere in Scotland. But probably the quickest win, because those markets take a while to build, will be taking some of the blue hydrogen and blending it into the natural gas grid. The plans in the UK and indeed elsewhere in Europe are to progressively decarbonise the gas grids by blending hydrogen into them. And certainly in a UK and European context, you can go from the current 0% hydrogen to 20% without major capital investment. You can ultimately go to 100%, but that will require a more wholesale change. So for countries like UK with a legally binding net zero commitment, blending hydrogen into the natural gas at source and therefore getting the decarbonised gas around the country quickly is a very big chunk and out of the net zero requirements, because it gets to some hard to abate areas like domestic heating, air conditioning, and commercial around the country. And I think that's my final slide. Thanks. Hopefully that was helpful, Ben.
That's great. Thank you, Nick. Let's move to another project in the UK. Alex, I'd like to introduce Net Zero Teesside, please.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you, Nick, for that great introduction. I should say I love the name Acorn, because as everyone knows, an acorn grows into an oak tree. And I think that's kind of very symbolic of what we're hoping to happen in the UK, and I'm sure across Asia as well for many of you on the call. I think we decided to go for a much more in-your-face name, which is Net Zero Teesside. There's no there's no subtle meaning to that. It is exactly what it says. I should also state, so I've been on the Net Zero Teesside project now for a couple of years. I've been sort of working directly for the project director, trying to help develop a number of different areas, both across the offshore and the onshore. Most recently working on some of our applications for funding, which are a critical element of getting this forward. I'm sure that will come up again later on. And now working on sort of some of our, leading some of our integration in the power and capture, which I'll speak about a little bit. Also, I always get the question, I enjoy a little bit of whiskey, hence the sort of exterior. So usually ends up becoming a question. So yes, I do enjoy a bit of whiskey. So a little bit about Net Zero Teesside. So we're a project, another one of the clusters, as is named in the UK. So Nick was talking about the sort of northeast Scotland. So we're working in the northeast of England. If you can see on that sort of map in the middle top of the current slide, you'll see where Teesside is. Not a lot of people outside of the UK, I think it's fair to say, know exactly where Teesside is. Essentially, it's on the River Tees. So what you're looking at in the sort of infographic on the right-hand side is the River Tees, and you can see, you know, the way the UK has developed is very much with clusters of industry. So that, you know, industry will develop where there's infrastructure, where there's demand, where there's ports, where there's rivers. So you see a number of collections of industries across the UK, which Nick alluded to earlier on. And so the Net Zero Teesside project is aiming to support decarbonisation of this region. So one of the advantages of Teesside is that it's very compact, so everything's quite close to each other. And as I mentioned before, CCS enables a huge range of technologies. So we're looking here at various different technologies. You can see across the bottom some of the, so we've got an existing hydrogen plant, we've got fertilizers, waste to energy, biomass, combined heat and power. There's already industrial sites in Teesside which we're looking to support decarbonisation. And then in the top right, you can see there was an old steel manufacturing site which we're repurposing. It's currently called the South Tees Development Corporation, and they've renamed it Tees Works. And what we're looking to do is build a sort of greenfield power and capture. So by power and capture, I mean a combined cycle gas turbine with a post-combustion capture on the back end of it. That would look to capture up to 2 million tonnes a year or so and then send to an offshore pipeline. But we're looking to build as well, to build upon the existing pipe networks within Teesside, and to try and sort of enable industries across Teesside to feed CO2 into that system, collect it at one site, the Tees Works site, and then support, you know, bioenergy. So Nick talked about net negative technologies. So we have a large biomass power station in Teesside that's due to start up this year, and that could enable another 2 million tonnes of negative CO2. So that CO2 that's been taken from the atmosphere and then burned in wood chips and then captured and stored under the sea. So that enables a suite of technologies that would enable us to reach net zero, hence the Net Zero Teesside name. So that speaks to some of the kind of areas we're working with onshore. If you could just move to the next slide, you'll see we have formed a partnership with the Humberside cluster. So for those who aren't aware, the Humber is kind of slightly further south of Teesside. You can see here you're looking at the edge of the UK. Some of you may be familiar with York and Hull and some of these other areas which are labelled on this map. But we've formed a partnership with Humberside, which we're calling the Northern Endurance Partnership, and it's based around Endurance is a large four-way dip sailing structure offshore in the North Sea, nearby some of the existing oil and gas operations that we have in the North Sea. And what we're looking to do is collect CO2, as I just said, across Teesside and across Humberside, and then send to one store. So we're looking at this as one sort of mega offshore project that can enable support decarbonisation of 2 industrial clusters in the UK. As Nick said, the critical part of all of this is that you can't decarbonise the UK from one cluster. Everything needs to go ahead, and that's what we're really trying to support development of. And so this project is looking at developing capture of, it says 10 million tons of CO2. We could do slightly more than that if we're collecting from Teesside and Humberside. There's definitely the opportunity to go 20, 30 megatons. The emissions are there at the moment, and we're looking to really kind of kickstart something. So the other thing you can see on the sort of top right hand side is some additional dotted lines. We're looking at where we can extend into other stores across the North Sea and create like a network of CO2 storage sites using different saline aquifers that are kind of there with the Bunter sandstone, which is a very good formation for CO2 storage, we believe. But there's also a lot of depleted oil and gas, or mainly gas, around this area, reservoirs that could be quite interesting for future storage. So there's a really positive story, and we're looking to kickstart that project in Teesside. So I'm sure there'll be plenty of other kind of interesting discussion points later, but I'll pause there to pass on.
Alex, that's fascinating. Thank you. For the third presentation, I'm going to turn to Jim Yao. I'm going to contrast this a bit in terms of project development in the UK with some of the activities that are going on in Asia, and particularly ADB support for those activities. Jim Yao, I'll hand over to you. Thank you. Possibly still on mute, Jim.
Yeah. Okay. It works. Thank you, Ben. Very glad to join this event to discuss the CCUS topic. ADB is a multinational development bank based in Manila, tackling climate change, building climate and disaster resilience, and enhancing environmental sustainability is a priority of ADB. In terms of the climate financing commitments, we are guided by our strategy 2030. For 2019 to 2030, ADB committed $80 billion in climate finance cumulatively. Last year is a very difficult year for many member countries of ADB, and they sought more support for renewable energy and energy efficiency. There were 4.2 billion total energy sector lending approved, increasing 72% from the 2019. Total clean energy investment is about 2 billion. Energy sector lending takes account 20% in our bank, and 47 lending are used for clean energy. About 83% of approved energy projects will address climate change mitigation and adaptation last year. This is a big picture of the ADB energy sector lending. ADB established CCS fund since 2009 with the support of the UK government. The CCS fund aims to accelerate the physical deployments of CCS demonstration projects by promoting projects engaged in capacity development, supporting geological investigation and environmental studies related to the potential carbon dioxide storage sites, and undertaking community awareness and support programs. This fund provides support on CCS related activities to Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Mongolia, Pakistan, China, Thailand, Philippines, and Vietnam. By the end of last year, there were 19 projects are supported by CCS funds. The two figures are CCS allocation by region and sector. All CCS funds are located in energy sector. ADB supported establishment of CCS Center of Excellence, CO2 EOR pilot projects, regulatory framework in PRC and Indonesia. So the share of the CCS fund allocation in East Asia and Southeast Asia is more than other regions. ADB has recognized the CCUS will play an important role for its DMCs in energy security, maximize economic use of current infrastructure, and reducing GHG emissions. So ADB has adopted a comprehensive approach in supporting DMCs on CCS development through these aspects. ADB is updating energy policy. The draft report is being circulated for interdepartmental review in ADB internal. I excerpt the CCUS relevant paragraph here. ADB will continue providing capacity development, technical assistance, and advice on enabling regulatory measures in support of the DMC programs to identify and remove the hurdles to the development, demonstration, and commercialization of CCUS technologies, realizing the crucial role of this technology in the long term, particularly for the difficult to decarbonize industry sectors. ADB supports the CCUS investment for industry. ADB refers from financing CCUS in the context of the EOR. So ADB's position on CCUS is very clear. We will continue to support it. The draft of the policy, the updated policy, could be circulated for outside comments and will be finalized this year. It will be launched after ADB management approval by the end of this year or early next year. This is the list of the undergoing CCUS projects. We are conducting a CCUS readiness study in Bangladesh for the power industry, helping stakeholders of this country understand the CCUS technology and find opportunities to reduce costs and prepare for future energy transition. ADB is updating the CCUS roadmap for China, which will reflect the latest climate goals announced by their President Xi Jinping in September 2020. The study results will be launched in the first half of this year. We also implemented 2 pre-feasibility studies on CO2 capture and utilization in refinery and cement of India. ADB published a CCUS compendium last weekend. It showcases the new and innovative low carbon technologies that are being demonstrated or are in early commercialization stage. The collection features key highlights, advantages, applications, the status of the development and commercialization, and the potential for deployment in Asia. This compendium, this document aims to promote technology investment, transformation, and deployment, and identify supports needed to bring the technology to the pilot or early commercialization stage. You can access the document through this link. CO2 is a GHG, but also it can be feedstock. CO2 utilization would contribute to reduction of the new fossil fuel usage, and it will realize the carbon cycle to control the total amount of the CO2 emission from the perspective system to meet the needs of the human industry production for our daily life. The promotion of the CO2 utilization would accelerates the development of the capture, transportation, and policy, and reduce the cost to support the storage of the CO2. In order to reduce the CO2 emissions in a limited time, CCS is the best technology pathway. We lead CO2 utilization, and finally, we should focus on CO2 storage. Renewable power is a clean and low carbon energy. Its share will increase stably in the energy supply mix. The power generated from the fossil fuel without CCS will face much more challenge when it competes with the green power. CCS could help fossil power decarbonization, but it is not a solution to explore new coal power. In the new energy policy of ADB, it is likely that ADB will not finance any new coal power plants. A good technology will go through the readiness study, feasibility study, pilot testing, industrialization, and commercialization. We lead large-scale CCUS pilot projects in Asia. There are evidence that the growing portfolio of the large-scale CCUS projects has already contributed to cost reduction through project implementation. We will try to collaborate with the DMCs on these fields to facilitate CCUS in Asia. CCUS is indispensable to achieving full carbon neutrality or net zero emission. ADB will continue support it. The cost reduction and the business model will promote the CCUS prosperity. That's all from my end. And I'm stop here. Hand over to you, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. That's very interesting. Thank you very much. Let's launch into our moderated session, our Q&A session. I get obviously there's these regional differences to where the industry is in various parts of the world, but also there's a historical context as well. Nick mentioned some of the US projects which have been operating for a number of years, serving EOR mainly in the onshore US. We also are aware of large carbon capture projects here in Asia Pacific. In Australia, Gorgon's one of the largest projects in the world for CO2 sequestration. I just want to ask the panel, where do they think the business or the sector is in terms of maturity as a business? Is it still ground floor? Is it embryonic? Is it a pilot? Is it scalable? Is it mature in some cases? Nick, Alex, sorry, I'll turn to you first. You know, looking at this from the outside, so how would you characterize this as a as a timeline?
So in terms of characterizing where I think we're at as an industry, CCS is quite a broad, as we've probably heard now, is a very broad phrase. So just looking at the capture side and the sequestration side. So the capture side, generally speaking, a lot of the technology is, I like to use the phrase old pots and pans repurposed. So it's technology that we know how to use, that we've had plenty of decades experience with. You know, a lot of the capture technologies themselves are 100 years old. It's just using an amine in the case of post-combustion capture, and then sort of and capturing CO2 in a normal sort of industrial process. Generally speaking, for the capture element, it can be pre-combustion. So that's when you're taking the CO2 out of the fuel before it's been combusted. So something like some industrial processes, hydrogen may use that. You can burn your fuel in an oxygen-rich environment, and it makes it very easy to separate because you just have CO2 and water most of the time. And then you can capture the CO2 from a flue gas. That's from a burnt gas. So that's like most of what I would work with at the moment would be what I'd call post-combustion capture. And that's applicable for things like bioenergy, CCS, some industrial sources, power. A lot of those technologies have different technology maturity, some of which have been demonstrated pilot scale. So some of the new hydrogen processes, for example, are quite innovative. But generally speaking, most of what we're looking at in blue hydrogen is quite well advanced technology. So I would say that there's a range of technologies we talk about when we say CCS. Some of them are kind of off the shelf, ready to go. We're seeing large technologies, large atmospheric post-combustion technologies at work in North America and Canada, which is great. And then there's an enormous amount of CCS projects around that are working on the capture side. Indeed, in Teesside, and across the UK, there are, and across the world, there are industries which are capturing CO2 as a byproduct, but it's cheaper for them just to vent it. And that's just, hard to understand sometimes when we're talking about these expensive capture projects. Really, there's an enormous amount of scope to capture. The other element, as Nick talked about in his great diagram earlier, is the sequestration side. And that as well is technology, that we've seen used in the US for enhanced oil recovery a lot of the time. In the North Sea, places like Sleipner and Snøhvit, Equinor run projects that have been sequestering for many decades. So there's experience in using this stuff. I would say at the scale that we need to enforce change, and the IEA report published in 2019 suggests we need 5,000 to 8,000 million tons of CO2 per year by 2050 to sort of support some of the Paris goals. That scale is going to require a lot more. A lot higher scale businesses, and that's going to need a lot of support. So I think from a technology side, I would summarize by saying that we've got all the groundwork. There is some scale up that needs to be done, but really the immaturity of CCS as a business is primarily the commercial side. Where's the value for giving a return on sequestering CO2? I'm sure Nick can add a lot to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me turn to Nick now, because that commercial aspect is one of the key strands of this talk. And where would you sort of put things from a commercial perspective in terms of the maturity of the business?
Well, firstly, great answer, Alex. I think, and just to reiterate, firstly, what Alex has said, everything on that schematic diagram I showed before, all elements of that chain are operational now around the world. So hypothetically, if anybody on this call wanted to set up that today, they could do it. As Alex said, there are some areas where particularly on the capture side, be it industrial power or direct air capture, and on the hydrogen manufacture side, where there are already established technologies, but they need to get cheaper and more efficient. And so that's the area to watch. There will be iterations of the technology that will get better and cheaper, but it's already now. As Alex said, commercial is the issue, and the UK is quite a good example of that. We should already have an established CCS or series of CCS projects in the UK. There's been 2 false starts. Even the Acorn Project is on its 3rd reincarnation. It was previously a BP project called Long Gannet. It was then something called Goldeneye, which is a Shell project, and now it's called Acorn. And hopefully it's 3rd time lucky for this, for Net Zero Teesside and the rest. So the UK has been a good example of a government that's learnt as it's gone along, but has taken forwards and backwards steps in CCS, and has not provided clear rules and fiscal incentives to make these projects bankable and investable. That has fundamentally changed in the last 18 months in the UK, and hence we're seeing the rapid takeoff, I hope, of these projects and development of them. But it's the clear fiscal rules that to make these projects investable that are absolutely crucial, because while there will be some public sector support in the form of grants or ECA type activity, the majority of it will be private sector investment. And whilst I think the zeitgeist has changed and the private sector really does want to invest in this stuff now, it still needs to be able to understand the rules of the game and make a rate of return. And so that is the key bottleneck on this, rolling this out around the world. It's not technological, it's clear rules of the game from the host governments.
Thank you, Nick. I'm going to turn to Alan as well on this question, because he's obviously advised and seen a number of projects all around the world, and he seems to have also been involved in current, what we hope are going to be successful projects, but maybe some ones in the past that haven't been successful. Alan, what about your sort of viewpoint on it? Is it a kind of steady progression in the right direction that it's been, or is it been fits and starts? And why do you think we might be on the right track now, if indeed we are?
I think we are, firstly, which is encouraging. I'll be optimistic, but I think it feels like fits and starts, but I think in reality, we have been learning lessons. We have been making progress, even where projects have fallen away. I mean, it's very frustrating to work, as we did in the last competition on, and many people did on projects which we thought were good CCS projects to move the industry forward, and then have the rug pulled from under us. But I think the reason I'm more optimistic now, and what's changed really, I think, is the recognition that CCS is part of energy policy and not just an experiment. And I think it felt very much previously like we were going back to the analogies you used. It felt we were in a very much sort of pilot or prototype phase, even though the projects were huge. They were billion-dollar projects. It felt like the government, particularly in the UK, were looking at those as one-off projects to test the industry. I think the difference now is, certainly from my perspective, firstly, it feels like this is front and center of policy. And I think we're seeing that in the announcements coming out of the EU, out of UK and various other governments. But I think as well, we have over that period of time managed to get, certainly as an institution, get comfortable with some of the risks around CCS. I think many of the banks that have been involved looking at CCS are now, coming back to the industry, focused on, their role and how they can move things forward. So I think from my perspective, I think it is reason to be optimistic, and I think there's a positive momentum. Some of the business models, I mean, we may come onto it later, but certainly the business models that are coming out of UK government at the moment support the industry as well, I think, in terms of direction of travel. I think the devil is in the detail, but there is a recognition there that there are some risks which certainly the finance community are not willing to take, and obviously are quite difficult for equity to take. So, if those models get implemented as we hope, then I think we could see the first sort of commercial CCS projects in the UK and finance projects as well.
Thank you.
I mean, there are other areas where financing is coming forward. I mean, in the US, we're now starting to see financing for CCS under the US codes. And that's, again, going to be encouraging for the industry overall, because we're yet to see a fully financed CCS project, even though we've seen them built.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I just wanted to really sort of delve into sort of business models a bit. And, I'm just conscious that the panelists are all focused on slightly different parts of the value chain or the CCS, CCUS chain. I'm just interested personally, what parts of it you think are, viable, why you've chosen to focus your energies on certain parts of the business. Nick, maybe I'll come to you first. What you think you're bringing to the table in this whole vast arena?
Well, Ben, I think what we found is that whilst we are ourselves a rock-led company, so we start with the store, because without the store, you don't really have the related value chain of activities. So it's the enabler, the geological storage. We start from there, but what we found is quite quickly is that to get the store used quickly enough, you need to stimulate the demand. And that's to get the investment returns you need. There's no point in building one of these and then waiting a decade for the CO2 to turn up. Now, I think the world is changing, and we're going to be swamped by CO2 volumes collectively in Northern Europe soon. But you do need to be sure that demand is there before you start construction. It's the same as any other major project. You need to understand both sides of the equation. So we actually elected to be part of stimulating that demand. We could see that there was economic rent in all elements of that value chain. There are a series of very different businesses. If you like the offshore storage, if we're being unglamorous about it, certainly in the UK, it's a regulated waste disposal business. Now, hopefully it's a lot smarter than that, but that is, simplistically one way you could look at it. The midstream component will be like an industrial gas shipping business, very similar to, to those which already exist around the world. And the upstream businesses, they're going to be a combination of merchant models and other solutions. So there's quite a lot of different ways to play this. But from our perspective, it's starting with the store, but selectively investing to ensure that the store is filled and used properly.
Thank you. Alex, and you seem to be, you've got your fingers in a lot of pies in Teesside. There seems to be almost endless opportunities. When you wake up in the morning, where do you focus your time?
It's a good question. I think BP on this project has taken quite a big punt on both the offshore and the onshore. So we have a huge geology team you know, a lot of experience in working underneath the ground. We've been doing it for over 100 years. So so there is a team very focused on that I work with. Me personally, I'm more focused on the onshore side. So I think Nick's right. The store is the gateway. You know, you need the rock to store it in before you can start capturing. Otherwise, it's just a very expensive project to capture CO2 and release it again. So I think where I'm focused on is primarily the power and capture. So we went through a long sort of selection process on what we thought was the kind of the most mature technologies that we could get confidence in working at the soonest. And we took the kind of view that both commercially and technically, the power sector was the best place to start in bringing good anchor projects to, as Nick said, stimulate that demand for future projects. Because really, this isn't solved by one project. This is solved by the phase 2, 3, 4 incremental growth. So we saw that from the commercial side. Perhaps we'll talk about a bit more later on. I know Alan's got a lot of experience on a dispatchable power agreement, which is kind of like guaranteeing a power price to a certain extent to make sure that there's a kind of the risk of not having any returns is taken away. So we looked at developing that, but in terms of the power and capture, and perhaps why it's also really relevant for Asia, I mean, a combined cycle gas turbine produces flue gas, which is really hard to capture. It's only about 5% CO2, but you know, any coal projects just cannot take off in the UK. There's no demand or kind of public backing at all for a coal project for fairly obvious reasons. I think in across Asia there's a suite of opportunities of, you know, perhaps newer coal, or, you know, across the Asia Pacific region as well, and actually it's quite nice CO2 to capture because it's quite high. It can be 10-15% of the flue gas volumes, and there's a proven, you know, experience of operating that. So post combustion capture we saw as a really good technology to that we saw was kind of the closest to being able to scale up. So that took away the technology risk for us. And the CCGT, the gas power in the UK, is something that we have a lot of experience in. So we fuse those together, and then commercially the dispatchable power agreement, or the dispatchable CFD as it was once called until the new note out from the UK government in December, we saw that as the kind of greatest level of certainty to kickstart the industry. So that's where I focus my time on.
Thank you, Alex. I'll turn to Jim Mao actually, because obviously some of the kind of pilot studies and initiatives that you've been working on around Southeast Asia, North Asia, etc. I mean, where are you seeing the interest in terms of business opportunities in this region? And do you think that this is a seed that can grow?
Yeah, ADB engaged CCUS work in Asia regions. During the past years, we focused on the capacity building and CO2 capture and utilization in difficult abated industry sector, and the largest large-scale CCUS demonstration projects in EOR. The relevant works has been introduced in my previous presentation. I don't want to repeat it again. So, you know, CCS is emerging, complex, comprehensive, and huge engineering technology. So for a lot of the Asian countries, cost and public awareness are two aspects to be improved for the CCUS promotion in Asia. So ADB will continue to engage the capacity building and framework to pave the roads of the CCUS. For the opportunity of the CCUS in Asia region, I think CO2 utilization will be a key point in a couple of years.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Focus on the U then of CCUS. Thank you.
Yes.
I'm going to just skip a question here that we scripted, and I'm just going to sort of pick up on some of the policy points. And who needs to make the first move here? Alan talked about some of the initiatives from the UK government, and we've heard from Nick on the sort of certainty of fiscal policy and commercial models. But just if you were to design this business from zero, Alan, where would you start? What are the kind of key policy objectives? Who needs to make the first move?
I think ultimately it needs to be government to make the first move. And here, with in terms of government, I'm not talking about government throwing lots of money at it. I'm talking about government recognizing, as I was mentioning, in Europe, we have the need for CCS, and then including that in policy. Because I think without a clear view of where the industry is going and why the industry is necessary, it's very difficult for developers to develop a project, for banks to finance the sector. So the first step inevitably has to come from government, and also necessary because there will need to be public support. There's a cost attached with this. As Nick said, I think it's a waste disposal business in many respects at the moment, although it can develop into use, and hopefully it will develop into use. But government has a key role in actually stimulating the sector, and it's different for different regions. I can talk about the UK because we're quite close, hopefully, to a business model that works. But if you look in the Middle East, we're looking really there at carbon capture for EOR. In the US, carbon capture for EOR. So I think in each market there's a different reason for developing the industry. But you need the support, the frameworks to actually make that industry viable and make it make sense.
Nick, could you just expand on this cross-border? One of the things, in terms of first mover, it seems like it's a way for, in this case, the UK, maybe Norway and other countries bordering the North Sea to really carve out a business opportunity for themselves and to offer their services in terms of sequestration and some of the other additional businesses to others in that locality in the European area. How important is that cross-border aspect to your business, to the business of CCS in the UK, for example?
Ben, I'd say that, the UK government is focused on the UK's legally binding net zero targets. So the way the UK government is looking at these 4 clusters is around solving domestic emissions. But there is a recognition that, because we're lucky geologically, as is Norway, that we should be taking more than just our own domestic emissions. And so there were actually some recent changes to it's rather arcane maritime law, but something called the London Protocol, to allow CO2 as a waste product to be shipped across borders, and I think that's global now. So I think when you look at projects, Alex was talking about net zero Teesside going to 10 million tonnes a year or so, and potentially 10 to 20 or 30. We've got similar potential. Our 3 pipelines can take 20 million tonnes a year, and if we choose to build new pipelines, we can put more in. I think you'll see the UK project starting off, hopefully mid-decade with UK emissions, but very quickly, perhaps even only a year or 2 later, you'll start to see European emissions coming in. Northern Lights, the Norwegian project, which is another excellent project, recently showed an order book, or a potential order book, of over 40 million tonnes, most of which came from outside of Norway because they don't have a big industrial base. From our experience, our project, and I'm aware of at least one other UK cluster, has got a similar conceptual order book. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to expect that by 2030, you'll see all the UK projects scaling up through 10, 20 million tonnes per annum, and increasingly volumes coming in from across Europe. And I think that is a pattern that you would see in Asia Pacific, as soon as the governments give the rules of the game, as Alan said, and people can get started, because the geological basins that are best for storage are not necessarily always at the same point as emissions, but there's no reason why you can't join the dots and tie it all together in exactly the same way.
Thank you. Actually, while we're on that subject, I think, I want to talk a bit about, we talked a little bit about grants, we talked a little about financing. Alex is busy filling in applications for various forms of finance in Net Zero Teesside, but I just wanted to understand whether you think grants, and in this case in the UK it was a very significant grant, is it a good starting point for a government to offer grants for say, research, for pilot development, for concept development, for feed? I mean, turning to perhaps Alan first, do you think that has made a difference?
I mean, let's face it, if you're a CCS project, if the money is available, you're going to take it. It helps with, defraying the cost of that investment. I think grants have two purposes in my mind. One is to show some confidence in the sector. And the second is to facilitate the sector. I think it's been, clearly it's been useful to have money available for R&D. But I think we've gone a bit beyond the sort of R&D level now. I think, as Alex said, we know the technologies, we know we know how to put it together. We now need to actually build a plant to show that it works at full scale. And I think there you can use grant funding to a certain extent to de-risk the structuring of the project, certainly the capital structuring of the project. But I think those projects with the right commercial structure would actually be able to go ahead anyway without grant funding. It's not to say to the government in the UK, don't give the money. But the key thing is, again, I come back to it, is the framework in which these projects are going to be implemented. I mean, what the grant money would do is to reduce the cost of those initial projects, to make, to if you like, a step forward to commercialization, which is another big help.
Thank you, Alan. Jim, I'll turn to you, because ADB has actually deployed funds to some of these early stage projects. Do you think you've got value for money? Are you happy with the way that the funds have been spent and the progress that has been made?
Yes, of course. We will support this kind of activities. In Asia, a lot of the CCUS players have the same similar request for financing the support for their projects, especially for the early stage of the project, because it will reduce the investment risk for CCUS developer and enhance their investment confidence in early stage, as long as the suitable policy, CO2 emitters, the private sectors and the commercial capitals are willing to engage in this field to promote the development of the CCUS. For ADB, as a development bank, we will use our limited the money to level up lots of the private capitals to involve. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jim. That makes a great deal of sense. Alex, I'll turn to you last for this question. Maybe widen it a bit to the kind of support that you receive from the UK government, not just on the kind of funding side, but also the framework for potentially financing this very large scale project. I mean, are you satisfied with the direction of travel there? Are your applications likely to be successful? Are you confident?
So I think what Alan said about if the money's on the table, no one's not going to take it. I mean, that's very true. I think that there definitely needs to be a blended approach to incentivizing projects occurring. So one of that is to de-risk the kind of development costs, which is what the government's trying to do through various different funds. And I think that's really important. It could take half or a third of your feed cost as a kind of, to de-risk that, so to speak, the capital risk. I think really the critical element is in the paying the bills when the project started. And I think what we need above everything is to start, is to have a demonstration project, get something going, get those learnings in place, because that's what's going to incentivize learnings and ultimately cost reductions. You can't reduce costs without at least having a pilot or a large scale project starting to learn as we go. And I think, to use the wind industry in the UK as an example, I mean, it's very different. It's not a direct comparison, but the government has incentivized a lot of wind projects and essentially subsidized a huge amount of that through the contract for difference, so guaranteeing a power price that is would give a level of profit. And those power prices initially were 4, 5, 6 times higher than the sort of standard power cost in the UK. But I mentioned I wrote my dissertation a decade ago. Since then, the UK wind industry has become 5 times larger, and the CCS industry has just got failed projects to look at because it hasn't had the same incentive. So I think I can't stress enough the importance of the governments working with the government and the private sectors to get these commercial models that work, because ultimately it's not about trying to demonstrate cost competitiveness now. It's about looking into the future and what the lowest system cost of creating power, creating low carbon heating, and underpinning things like intermittent renewables that will need some other technologies to support that. So I think having a holistic view of what the lowest system cost in 20, 30 years would look like and trying to use the right policy incentives is what we really need in the CCS space, because it's not going to take off without some of that support and without some of that risk to be shared.
Let me just ask a question, some more technically focused guys in the room here. One of the questions from the audience came in from Thomas Brio about assurance, and us in the finance community, we're also very concerned about this idea of greenwashing. And I suppose the nub of the question is, if you put CO2 back into those depleted reservoirs, whether they be saline or depleted oil and gas reservoirs, is it going to stay there? How can we be sure about that? Who's certifying it? I'd have to ask Nick first.
Sorry, that was the rock nerd answers this one. Firstly, people should realize that it's not solid rock. Rock has pore space, so it's like a sponge. Visualize it that way. The oil and gas industry, as Alex said, over the last century or so, has got a pretty good handle on how these rocks work and where they provide efficient stores. And it is simply the reverse process. You are putting CO2 into pore space in rocks and replacing the saline water, the seawater that effectively sits in there. So as long as you know what you're doing and you understand rocks and you have the appropriate information before you start to do it, it is a perfectly safe process. If you think about it, these rocks in many cases have held hydrocarbons safely for tens of millions of years without any leaks. And so there's no reason why that can't be replicated for CO2. So it is a permanent store. However, there is the very low probability but high risk event of leak. You can't ignore that. You would expect it to be almost a 0 probability in almost every case, because the companies doing this are typically oil companies or people with oil company backgrounds, so they understand the rocks and what's required. In the UK context, the assurance will come in terms of the response. The assurance comes through monitoring, and you'll see the same in Norway as well. Repeated seismic surveys can show where the plume of CO2 goes in the rock, so you can see where physically it's going. And there are other tools which will enable you to continue to monitor where the CO2 is going and where it's sitting. In terms of the responsibility for that, the operators of a project are responsible for safe storage during the operational life of the project. And then at the end of the project's natural life, and these will run for multi-decades, but at the end of that natural life, there will be a tail period where the responsibility will still remain with the operators. And I think it's still being determined in the UK, but it's likely to be about another 5 years. Thereafter, the risk will go back to the state effectively as the underwriter. So it's very much like other sort of permanent storage situations. And part of the £1 billion that's been proposed for grant support for or capital support from the UK government will be used for supporting the insurance requirements of this longer term risk. So that's the model that's being used for the UK. So the message to take from it is this is a very straightforward process. The rocks can hold the CO2 for tens of billions of years, if not indefinitely. You can monitor where the CO2 is going. If you know what you're doing, the risk leak is negligible to 0, but there are legal mechanisms and insurances in place to cover it if you need to.
I got to ask Alan, as a fellow financier, when he's putting his credit paper together, and he's looking at his risk analysis and thinks about what's keeping him awake at night. Does leakage of the sequestered CO2 come to the top of your list, Alan, or is there other bigger concerns?
It's certainly near the top, I have to say, and I agree. And certainly, as you're well aware, we've got reservoir engineers internally as well. They view it as a very, very remote risk, but the impact of leakage, particularly when you've got to pay for the CO2 that's leaked at the carbon certificate price, can be devastating on the company. So from a financier's perspective, it's one of these very low probability, very high impact risks. And it's also somewhat worrying that the insurance industry are not willing to stand behind that risk in entirety as well. So it's one of those areas where long discussions with government ended up hopefully in a position where they're effectively the insurer of last resort. So people take their share of that risk, but there's recognition that if it goes above a certain level, like the nuclear industry, for example, then government have to really backstop that risk, because no commercial company is going to be is going to be able to really stand behind that risk, or indeed potentially meet the costs if there is leakage.
Thank you. We got a couple of sort of big questions that I want to get to before we close. We've got around 15 minutes of the session left. Carbon pricing. Do you as industry practitioners believe that we need to have a realistic price for carbon in order to really accelerate development of CCS? In my sort of simple mind, if emitters were getting hit in the pocket for their CO2 emissions, and someone like Nick or Alex walks in the room and says, "Hey, I can take that off your hands as a solution here," it's surely a sort of easier conversation. Can I just sort of go around the panel here and maybe start with Alex? Do you believe that seriously, punitive, for want of a better word, carbon pricing is required in order to stimulate this business?
So I'm sure BP has sort of its view on this as well. What I would say is, I think in the long term, I think absolutely, there's definitely a requirement to put a monetary value on CO2 in a penalty sense. So there needs to be a structural incentive across the board if we're really going to meet some of the really ambitious targets we've got. And it's just not there at the moment. I think in the short term, perhaps slightly midterm as well, we just need to be careful of the secondary and tertiary effects of applying an across the board carbon tax, and what that may mean for shifting across borders, about what it might mean for putting businesses that are trying to make the difference but don't perhaps have the capital at the time to make a difference. And I think that's where this policy incentive is so important, because it kickstarts it perhaps takes some of that initial risks and initial high costs out of the equation and incentivizes the right behaviors, for which then future carbon price increases don't take the same sort of bite. So I think, yes, in the long term, carbon pricing is going to be really important. A method that works across borders, because the Earth doesn't really care where the CO2 comes from. CO2 is CO2. In the short term, I think policy as a structure to start with is probably more important, but an element of carbon tax as well. The two are going to have to work together over the next 20 years or so.
Thanks, Alex. I'll turn to Alan actually next. What's your view in terms of really stimulating development of CCS, CCUS? Is a carbon tax required?
It no doubt would help. I mean, it's effectively recognizing that there is a cost to carbon, so it sort of supports the rationale for CCS. I think in terms, we've looked at a number of ways of financing off of the carbon certificates, for example, CCS previously for the Teesside industrial cluster. And I think one of the challenges of financing off of those kind of revenues, or those kind of the taxes and the certificates, is that the political dimension to how those frameworks or how those schemes are put together. So it's been quite difficult to actually finance off of the carbon certificate values tax impacts of carbon. I agree as well with the carbon leakage point, because if you don't apply those taxes universally or across a large part of the energy economy, then industries are going to either be penalized unfairly by the tax or move somewhere else to a low carbon tax environment. And that's one of the challenges of the European trading scheme, was to make sure that didn't happen. And ironically, the way of dealing with that was to give some of the emitters either exemptions or free certificates. So you're not really achieving, in many respects, what that scheme was set up to do. So I think it's something which is useful, but needs really careful planning and thought going into it.
Thank you. Nick, I mean, you're always keen to offer an opinion on sort of big policy points like this. What's your thoughts looking at the industry in a broad perspective?
You need to show direction of travel on carbon pricing. Carbon needs to be priced. It doesn't need to be priced at, I think your word was punitive. It doesn't need to be a punitive level to start with. I mean, some of the Scandinavian countries are coming out with carbon pricing in the hundreds of dollars a ton range, which is not necessary, I don't think. But if you look at other economies like Germany, for example, they're putting a floor carbon price of 55 euros a ton in from 2025, scaling up to 65 a couple of years later. That's pretty useful, because that sends a very strong signal to their industrial base that the world that they're going to operate in 4 or 5 years time is going to look quite different. And with the investment cycle that they require to start taking on things like carbon capture and be part of these value chains, they need 3, 4, 5 years of forewarning. So I think a scaling pricing of carbon is absolutely crucial. It doesn't need to be in the hundreds of dollars a ton range, but it certainly needs to be in the rising tens, if that helps. I think you'll see in the next 12 months, if you ask the question in 12 months' time, you'll see probably more, quite a lot more thinking coming to the public domain on this. You know, the EU proposed carbon border tax, I think is quite a game changer if that happens. There's quite a lot of ramifications, per Alan's point, around that and global supply chains. And there is discussion in the UK in the run-up to COP26 about potentially putting specific carbon pricing on certain products in the UK economy, which again would change consumer and industrial behaviour. So it's these signals that are required, because otherwise, if you look at it, you've got a lot of organisations with voluntary net zero pledges, like Microsoft, very public, who are going out and voluntarily undertaking these activities, even though it's not economically rational for them to do it today. And there is an increasing subset of industries doing that, and that's excellent. But the majority of industry will wait until the economic stars align. And so you need to give them a sort of a 5-year window to start planning for, with increasing pricing over that time frame, I think.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Jim Murray, maybe I'd
may I add
to you for the same question. I mean, what are you seeing as effective? Do you believe that carbon taxes will be required across Asia, inter-Asia?
I think it is beneficial to integrate CCUS into carbon market. Carbon pricing is an important driver for CCUS, such as in Norway and in Canada. So in Asia, for example, China is building the emission trading system. So for this country, they can learn from Canada to allow the CCS project generate multiple emission reduction credits linked to the certificate emission reduction scheme. This approach could be useful mechanism to accelerate the CCS deployment. The usage of the auction revenue for financing CCS, such as the EU NER 300 and NER 400 scheme, is also a good example for Asia countries.
Thank you, Jimmy. So I'm going to finish on this last question, and that's really turning the focus towards Asia. And Nick, you were quite forthright, and some of the business models that are currently in operation in the UK could be applicable here. There's other aspects that may be fairly different. I mean, do you think, firstly, is CCS, CCUS an imperative in Asia? Can we rely on other countries that are perhaps further advanced to remove that CO2 that we need to be removed from the atmosphere? Or do you think there's advantages in Asia that, you know, perhaps a company like Storegga or BP could take advantage of, and you know, there's a viable business here?
So, Ben, I think there's several elements to your question. Is CCUS an imperative for Asia? Yes, is the simple answer to that. Should Asia be relying on other countries to do it for it? No. Asia's got the emissions, it's got the rocks, it's got the capital. It just needs to pull together the frameworks. And I think it would be wrong on this call to say that it has to be the UK model. It doesn't. It doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be the Norwegian model. But I think that they are interesting and adaptable templates that can be probably bettered in Asia and can avoid several years of learning if people choose to go that route. I think, is there an appetite to do it in Asia? Yes. You know, from our own perspective, we're an independent company, but we've just completed a funding round, which we'll announce tomorrow, and two very high-profile Asian investors have backed us, not just to progress Acorn, but to be active in Asia Pacific, building Acorn-type projects to help roll out these templates. So we hope there's an appetite for it in this part of the world.
Thank you. I turn to Alex as well. I mean, from what you've heard so far and what you know about the global CCS business, you think there's a viable models that can be rolled out here as well?
Yes, absolutely. I think one thing I would state, as I said, CO2 is a molecule. It doesn't have a nationality. I think action is needed across the board. So, you know, I think there's also an enormous opportunity. You know, across the Asia Pacific, there's a really strong supply chain of construction sort of capabilities that could be really well purposed for this. So I think there's value to be unlocked in being a first mover as well. As Nick said, you don't need to necessarily follow the UK's model. We haven't necessarily got it right. We're still learning quite a lot. In fact, we've spent the last decade learning and iterating, and I'm sure there's learnings that can be built upon, but it's by no means the right way of doing it. And then I would also add one of the other advantages that the Asia Pacific region as well has is enormous experience in shipping. And I think we haven't talked in too much detail about the Northern Lights projects, but you know, you could argue that the furthest ahead of all the projects in Norway is the Northern Lights project, which is based around shipping. So as Nick said, the London protocols changed, so CO2 is no longer a toxic compound that has to stay within countries. I think there's an enormous future market, and we haven't focused on that too much in the UK yet, because we've got that industrial clusters model. We have a lot of point sources of CO2 that we can do at lower cost to begin with, but there's a real potential future opportunity of connecting source with sink using shipping, and I think Asia is very well placed to take advantage of that.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Alan for the final comments, because I mean, I benefit a lot from what Alan has done in Europe and the Middle East and the US, because you know, some of the work that he's done in renewable energy, in wind and solar, you know, frankly speaking, we're starting to roll out in this region now, probably five or so, or even 10 years behind where he was. And I just, with your depth of experience in CCUS, I mean, isn't Asia the next stop-off point for your financing efforts?
No, it has to be. As both Nick and Alex said, I think it's a huge potential market, a huge potential opportunity. And, you know, I agree that whilst you should take the learnings of the business models that we've had in Europe, I think what we've learned from offshore wind, from renewables, other rollouts that we've done in the region is that you don't need to replicate exactly what's being done elsewhere. You just need to be aware of the mistakes that were made and avoid those to try to leapfrog to a better place more quickly. And I'm convinced that in Asia there's the opportunity to far exceed what's happening in Europe and to also do it better. I mean, you know, we've as Alex said, we've been 10 years or more trying to make it work. You know, there's an opportunity to take that learning, do it better, and hopefully roll out more quickly. And so I'm quite optimistic about the region.
Thank you. Hey, I'm going to wrap up now. I want to thank the panelists today, Jimao, Alex, Alan, Nick. It's been fantastic to talk to you. Honestly, I could have talked for another 2.5 hours, I'm sure. In terms of takeaways from this session, I think I wanted to show this huge opportunity, and I wanted to show the kind of encouraging progress and give people real impetus and excitement about the possibilities for CCS and CCUS. I think it's been really important to hear about the kind of policy progress, and how the UK is sort of one model about kind of getting things started, setting the framework, and facilitating these what are now large-scale projects. I think the collaboration across borders is really an interesting concept, something which we often find quite difficult in the Southeast Asia region, but perhaps this is an opportunity to really kickstart that kind of collaboration. The momentum's there. I'm really excited about the growth possibilities in this sector, not least for washed up oil and gas professionals like myself. That to me is really exciting, to be able to think about the people that could transition into CCS and CCUS and use their skills. And last but not least, I'm really encouraged that we're not taking such a huge technology risk in this area, perhaps not even as much as some of the work we've done in solar and wind power. I mean, we're really talking about, in a lot of cases, established technologies. But at the edges of that, on the direct air capture side, there's some really exciting possibilities. And Nick talked about potentially winding back the clock and taking CO2 emissions out of the atmosphere that emitted long ago. So to me, the opportunity is rather massive as well in that respect. And with that, please do keep in touch with the British Chamber of Commerce. We've got a number of events coming up, which I hope you find interesting. We'll continue the push on energy and utilities. The committee is very active on some new events coming up on hard to decarbonise sectors, on data centres and battery utilisation, on hydrogen, of course. So there's a lot of interesting energy and utilities events coming up, as well as these general events that you see in front of us. Last but not least, if there is a feedback form, if you enjoyed this seminar today, or you've disliked it, or you didn't get your question answered, then please fill in the feedback form and let us know how we got on. Thanks for your time today. Goodbye to all of you.